morning, everyone. Welcome to SharePoint Conference. My name is Sunay Vaishnav, and I'm a senior product manager on the Microsoft Flow team. With me today, I have David Blythe.
I'm one of the engineering managers for Microsoft Flow.
And today, we are going to tell you a little bit about Microsoft Flow. We have a great session for you today. We are going to talk about what Microsoft Flow is, what problems does this product try to solve, what ecosystem in the Microsoft suite of products does it belong to, and how it fits in the overall strategy with SharePoint, Office apps, and more. And we'll also briefly touch upon some of the admin and governance capabilities of Microsoft Flow, while also talking about who really is the audience for Microsoft Flow. So what kind of users should be using this product. So that's kind of the gist of it. And yeah, I'm very excited to talk about all these things with you today. So we as people are very good at remembering things across pen and paper. Most of our business processes involve us taking things down in notes or to-do apps, Wunderlist, etc. We are also very good at figuring out how to integrate applications and data across multiple systems. But we're not really efficient at it. For example, like I have to remember which version of a document was finalized, right? Was it version V 5.1 or 1.5? Every time I work with designers on my team, they put design assets in doc libraries or Dropbox or OneDrive, and I have to figure out manually when these new files have been uploaded, what changes have been made to them. All of these things require humans to go in, check things, and cascade data into other systems. Once I know what the updates are, let's say, for example, on the design files that my design team provides me, I kind of take those changes and move it forward to my developers who are probably going to work on integrating those designs into the product. This is all really manual, and we are not, as humans, really efficient at it. We are good at it, but not efficient. And these are like day-to-day tasks that don't require a lot of brain cycles in terms of creativity or thinking or logic, right? It requires you to just do the things like move file A from SharePoint to this other website, attach it to this task, and so on and so forth. And what if we could really automate these rote, mundane tasks that we do every day? Wouldn't it free you up and users within your organization to do more productive things? And that is kind of the core mission of Microsoft Flow. What we want to do is we want to empower users to build these kind of automations for their own personal productivity, team productivity, or even organizational-wide productivity. So that's kind of where Microsoft Flow sits in. And if I had to define it in like this one nice sentence, the core ethos of the product is to help people and teams work smarter by automating their business processes across apps and data, be it Microsoft first-party apps or third-party apps, be it data that you already have or new data that you're willing to seed into the Microsoft ecosystem. And more importantly, what we want to do is to achieve this without having our users worry about code or the technical intricacies that go with, automation tooling systems of the past. So before I jump deeper into, the core functionality of Microsoft Flow and what it has to offer, I want to talk a little bit about the Microsoft suite of systems or ecosystem where Flow sits in. Flow fits into the business application platform. It's a newly announced platform that encompasses a variety of products. The fundamental focus of business application platform is to empower users in their digital transformation journey. So if you look at the screen, we have Power BI, Flow, and Power Apps that are part of this ecosystem, and these applications are products are geared towards business users. What they enable, for example, Power Apps enables business users to build line of business applications without having to rely on IT or developer resources. And these applications are built fast. You don't have to necessarily learn how to write code, and they don't require a lot of time for you to invest into figuring out how to build these apps. You can fail fast while you build apps on Power Apps. You don't have to invest in figuring out what the infrastructure and the data systems underneath the covers are. And I'll talk about how that data comes into these applications as well. Flow, again, allows you to automate business processes. So imagine like Power Apps is going to collect and display data. When you interact with that data, Flow will do the things behind the scenes when users interact with these apps. Power BI, again, is the vector or the product that we recommend users use for measuring, analyzing, and kind of understanding the patterns of the data at a large scale. So if you have a lot of apps and you have a lot of flows pumping and operating with a lot of data, you want to understand what that data is doing and what it really means. And that's where Power BI comes in. And since these products are geared towards helping power users, they are at some level going to hit a wall. But the business application platform has a no-cliff story. So once your apps get really big and chunky and they have a lot of functionality in, and if you as an organization decide that, hey, I need some pro developers to go work on this, there's a seamless transformation and extensibility story into Azure. So pro developers can take your applications built on top of the business application platform and move it into Azure. So you get the reliability and scale of Azure. You can deploy an application in multiple geos and so on and so forth. So these kind of capabilities come out of box with the business application platform, and kind of the nature of us being part of the whole Microsoft ecosystem, we have hooks in all sort of directions. We hook into Azure. We also hook into like Office and SharePoint and other software products, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So overall, you have the power user, business user suite of products. You have the pro and the developer, IT admin kind of, persona related products as well. And then underneath them is a common layer of connectors and common data service. What connectors offer is an ability for you to connect to your data, irrespective of where it is, and bring it in to the Power Apps and Flow and Power BI ecosystems. We have over 225 plus connectors today. These are all first-party, third-party connectors with a variety of services. You can think about cloud services, SaaS apps, cloud storage apps, and so on and so forth, CRM and more. And if you want to bring all these, if you want to build applications on top of all of this data, you can use these connectors. If you don't want to use, continue using these apps, or if you have a net new requirement where you need to figure out where to store data, then Common Data Service comes into the play. So Common Data Service is, again, a structured data storage layer that allows you to push data in a schematized, normalized schema that all these applications can work against. And these applications natively understand how data is stored in CDS. So it is a more seamless experience for makers to go build applications against them. So let me talk a little bit more about the extensibility story, right? So I talked about how Business Application Platform is extending into Azure and also into SharePoint and Office. Today, these capabilities are already available within the SharePoint ecosystem. If you have noticed, there is a Flow and a Power Apps button in the modern lists and doclibs. This is because we are offering some of these capabilities of the Business Application Platform out of box. What you can do today is you can have a Power App that automatically renders a form so that you can enter data into a SharePoint site or a SharePoint list. Flows, on the other hand, can react to changes that you make on a document in a doc library or when a new item is added to a list or removed from a list or is modified in a list and so on and so forth. So you can do whatever you want after you detect changes that happen to these resources within your SharePoint ecosystem. It also extends into Office, so for example, Teams and other products. Similarly, on the other hand of the spectrum, we have Dynamics 365, which is a bespoke website and a portal that allows you to look at all the business applications deployed in your organization. So if I want to go and look at all the applications that I personally can use, because I've used them in context of SharePoint, I've used them in context of Teams, but now I want to understand what are all the applications that I have access to. This is the place where you go to understand, where to find out all the business applications that you have access to. It provides for a unified discovery and launching experience for apps. It also has a native integration with Flow, so you can kick off workflows that are triggered manually from this experience. So that's kind of the bigger picture with Business Application Platform. Now let's talk a little bit more in detail about Flow. So in essence, Flow is a workflow automation tool that allows you to create and model business logic. It works across 225 plus connectors out of box. Its primary function is to democratize automation and workflows. It allows for modernization and extensibility into on-premises data sources as well. It allows for governance through a single admin portal, and it offers features like native approvals and push notifications and a mobile app and so on and so forth. It is also deeply integrated into other Microsoft experiences, and we'll look at this in a little bit detail in a couple of slides. But that kind of is the gist and the core USP of Microsoft Flow. To help users get started, there are over 1,000 templates available on the platform. The animation kind of stuck there, right? Otherwise, it looks really cool. But yeah, there are over 1,000 templates that are available on the platform to get you started, so you don't have to worry about like writing code or figuring out the logic on how to write a workflow. One of the most common ones that we've seen our users use is send me a push notification when my boss sends me an email, which is like really cool because then you can immediately respond back to your boss and be like, look, I'm always checking my email 100% of the time. Then you have the connectivity piece, right? So I talked about 225 plus connectors, but it doesn't stop there. You have the ability to connect on premises, and there's a feature called custom connectors that allows you to connect to virtually any RESTful API and bring it on into the business application platform. So imagine that you have a custom-built application within your organization, and nobody else in the world uses that service. You can bring these services into Flow by building your own connector to it. And building a connector is fairly straightforward for advanced power users, where all you need to do is define the structure of these APIs and the services, and Flow Power Apps and other things in the business application platform will easily be able to connect to these, just like the connectors that we offer out of box. There's no difference in the functionality in the sense of out-of-box connectors versus custom connectors. So that's a really good thing to have. Okay, so at a high level, there are two types of flows, or workflows rather. There are automated workflows and there are business process flows. Automated flows are stateless, and they essentially execute logic or operations on behalf of the users who have created them. More specifically, though, it executes things based on the credentials you provided. So for example, if I give it a service account credentials, then it will perform those operations as if a service account or a service admin was performing those operations. If I give the Flow end user or my credentials, then it's going to behave and function as if I was operating or I was executing those operations. Automated flows always start with a trigger. This trigger can be automated as an event-driven. It could be scheduled. It could be something that you manually invoke from your phone or a Flow mobile app or from the website. Or it could be something that gets invoked from, let's say, an integration like SharePoint, Teams, or Power Apps. Business process flows, on the other hand, are these constructs that allow you to articulate business processes in a digital format. This allows for enforcing best practices within your organization. So imagine you have an onboarding process, and the first step of the onboarding process is to create a user for that person who's onboarding to the team. The next step could be to send them onboarding documentation. And you want to do that only after the user has been onboarded and a user has been created for them. So business process flows allow for modeling of these kind of constructs in the digital space. So who is really the audience for Flow? In our perspective, there are 3 types of users that can and benefit from the functionalities that Flow has to offer. The first category is the integrations user, right? These are not necessarily novice users, but these users are interacting not directly with Flow. They're interacting with other services and systems that Flow integrates with, right? So imagine that I upload a file to a SharePoint doclib, and there is a Flow that's watching that SharePoint doc library and waiting for a file to be uploaded, and when that file gets uploaded, it does something. So as a user who's uploading the file, I might not even know there's a Flow connected to this SharePoint doc library. These are the kind of users that may or may not see Flow running for them, but they always are getting benefits of it. And these users would lie on the left-hand side of the spectrum. So they're high volume, low sophistication users. Then as you go along the spectrum, you have citizen developers or power users. These users get their hands dirty and create flows for their own personal productivity and team productivity with automation. So they try to boost processes by building flows themselves. But they are not building flows on a large scale. They're not building flows that are overly complex. And more often than not, these users will use their own credentials. They won't be using service accounts and whatnot to orchestrate automation across like a variety of systems. So think like a team of 10 to 15 people, and then there are a couple of power users in that team. Those users would now build automations for the entire team, and everyone would get benefits from it. The third category is IT, admin, and pro developers. So these users are sophisticated users who know the lay of the land within their organization. What are the apps deployed? What are the services deployed within an organization? Where is all the data hosted, located, and so on and so forth? And these users are going to create sophisticated flows that are fairly complicated. They would be using advanced capabilities like loops, conditions, parallel branches, do-until loops, etc. And that's where we start seeing the sophistication rise and the volume of users building these kind of flows drop a little bit in comparison to the integration users. So that's kind of the gist of what Flow is, who is it for, and what kind of capabilities does it offer for new users. David now is going to talk about some integrations that we already offer out of box, and he's going to show a cool demo which showcases how an integration user might use Flow.
Thank you, Sunay. So like Sunay mentioned, Flow is all about connectivity, and we like to think of it as the glue between services that you're already using. That also, like you mentioned, includes the services that users are directly using, not just automation in the background, taking data from one service, pushing it to another, but also when users are directly interacting with things. I like to think of this as putting the flow directly in context with data that people are using, not in the background where something may be running when files are uploaded or data is changed. So as we showed before, within modern lists and libraries in SharePoint, you get Power Apps and Flow buttons. This lets users directly execute flows rather than them running automatically when some events happen. Additionally, there are pre-configured templates for that site and library directly available with one click from the Flow dropdown. So instead of having to choose the site and the library once you make it into the Flow Designer, those templates are already pre-configured for that list and library. We recently extended that, what we call the widget or the embedded view within OneDrive for Business as well. So that users who are maybe using OneDrive as the source for their files before publishing to SharePoint libraries can also automate and leverage flows for running processes. One of the other integrations that we have is, right now in preview, is Flow directly embedded within Excel desktop and Excel on the web. So maybe the data isn't all just in files or lists and libraries, but for finance or analysts, maybe the data is in tabular form within Excel spreadsheets. Those rows and the data therein can be used as input into flows as well. So maybe the process is to take and send approval or email or notifications or push into SharePoint. And whatever you could do with Flow, you can now trigger from within Excel directly, rather than needing to build some other process on top of that, some other entry form, a Power App, or something else to be able to trigger processes. And finally, there we go, Teams. So everything in the last year and probably the next year is all about Teams. Lots of talks here at this conference, lots of talks at Ignite and Build and all of that. So Teams is really big, and Flow wants to be a part of that as well. Because that's where, like Sune mentioned, that's where the users are. That's where the data is. That is the hub for things that happen on a daily basis. So we have a couple integrations with Flow, and I'll actually show a little bit in a second, something that just released 1 to 2 weeks ago, I think. So initially, we started with a personal app. So this would be targeted more at power users who are already familiar in building flows, managing approvals on the Flow portal. They can now embed that with the app from the Teams App Store directly within the Teams client, both on web and desktop. So again, power users, it's people who are already doing things. The next step that we added on top of that is that app can be embedded within a team channel itself. So what that does is that scopes the list of flows that are shown to the user to be flows that are available to that team. So flows that have been shared to the underlying modern group that all users would have run or ownership access to would be available there. So I've seen this in use. Microsoft teams use that, where a lot of DevOps teams have flows that run either manually or in the background to automate flows, and they go put that directly within the team that they use for communication because they now have quick access. They don't need to jump over to Flow to go find something to make some tweaks to their alerting or data collection flows. And finally, with the app comes the Flow bot. So when that first released, there was only some basic functionality about listing and running certain types of simple flows. So we're building that out, but the features that we just released are Flow bot actions. So a lot of the team's newer functionality is only available to bots, and so we built this into our bot so that you can use that within Flows itself to do things like posting adaptive cards to users, posting directly to users, not as the account of whoever set up the flow, but posting as Flow itself. And so I'm going to show a quick demo in a second about responding to approvals, not on the Flow mobile app, not on the Flow portal, not within the actionable email that some of you might be familiar with, but from within Teams itself. Let me switch over. So here I have a very quick SharePoint list that I threw together. And I'm going to use this as the starting point to be able to trigger flows. So maybe I have users coming to this list and library to interact with these. Maybe they're entering data, or maybe they just are viewing data here and they want to kick something off. So there's a couple options to do this. As mentioned before, I could select an item and run a flow directly from within here. So I have a hotel approval flow set up and tied to this particular list. The other way that is a little bit less known, but maybe is a better use case for users, is to use a column formatter to tie a particular item in a button appearing here in a column to be able to run the flow. So I'm going to click this to kick off the flow, rather than selecting an item and going to the drop-down. So the flow widget, the flow embedded UX within SharePoint pops open, and now I can enter some optional comments to the approvers. So my flow is going to actually pull the approvers from a column in the list itself. SPC19. Okay, so now I'm going to kick that off. Now the flow is off running in the background. And we can go see that. You received it? Okay,
Yep.
Great. So what this flow is doing is, rather than sending the email and push notification to the Flow app, we are sending adaptive cards for that particular approval request to each of the users in the flow. So you can see that it's now waiting for the approval. I, in Teams, have now received a new card. So this is the request that I just generated with my comment. And I could, I'm going to put on my approver hat, not my requester hat. And I will say, like I could within the actionable email, looks great. And submit the request. Now, if I switch back over to the flow run, it's still running because I had 2 approvers as part of that approval. I was an approver, Sune was an approver. So now he is responding to the request, and he will also hopefully approve for me. And now you can see that the flow run completed successfully because all of the approval criteria, the all must approve, and I'll go into the details of this particular flow in a little bit later, but now I can see the flow was completed. So that flow could have then taken that request and gone and sent that to finance. It could have pushed data back into the SharePoint list itself. But as you can see, we've now, the new capability, and like I said, this is recent, is to be able to approve directly within Teams because that's where users are going to be. We want them to be able to receive requests where the users can most quickly respond and handle the requests.
That was a really cool demo, right? Oh, and there is a question.
So the way that it works, and I'll show a little bit, is in a few minutes, is as part of the approval action, there is an adaptive card JSON, and then there is an action that can post any adaptive card. So you could build your own custom adaptive card if you wanted. Right now, we only support read-only cards, except for this specific one type. Something that's coming in our roadmap is so that you could build custom adaptive cards that take input and have buttons. But then we use that action to post that card to the user that we want to see.
Where are the comments that you submitted and then the approver submitted stored?
So, great question. So approvals, Sune mentioned, we have built-in approval functionality to Flow. So approvals itself is stored in the common data service that was mentioned. So it's basically your database, you have access to it. You could even use there's a common data service connector as part of Flow and Power Apps as well that you could use to query and show all of the pending approval requests, who has responded, who hasn't responded. So all of that data is visible, either if you were to go dig into the common data service or use it with a connector.
And to add to that, that data is also exposed in the flow itself. So you could take the comment and potentially put it on one of the columns in the list itself.
Yeah, so all of that is part of the flow itself. So the inputs from both of our, what we typed into Teams would be available. So you could send a digest view when the approval is completed that said Sune said X, David said Y. Yeah.
So I do want to allow for sometimes for questions towards the end as well. And I see there are a couple of hands being raised. So we will definitely wait around and answer all your questions and after we show you all the things that we have in our presentation. So this is a good segue into jumping into understanding what the characteristics of a flow that David built are. And in order to better understand like what the flow does, I wanted to talk a little bit about some fundamental building blocks, right? Let's understand what are the characteristics that flow offers. Then in the next demo, look at how David built that flow that automated an approval request into Teams, and then what potentially can be done after that approval happens, right? So at a high level, again, flow starts with an automated trigger, right? It's an event or a manual action that someone takes within a third-party or a first-party ecosystem. A flow then, once this trigger happens, it starts running, can perform any number of actions. You can have advanced things like conditional operations, loops, parallel branches, sort of parallel executions within the loop, and more of those kind of features are also available if you wanted to make use of those. You can also have one flow invoke other workflows. So imagine that I have a parent approval process, and then depending on what happens within the approval, I want to kick off a few other workflows at the tail end of it or in the middle of the process. You can do that as well. So moving on, let's take a look in detail as to what a flow really looks like. So on the screen, you can see there is a trigger at the very top, which is when a new record is created. And this asks the user to specify what organization and which tabular data or sort of which entity in the CRM system the record is created. But you could replace that with when a new item is added to a SharePoint list, and you would similarly have to provide the SharePoint site and the list name, and then whenever a new item is added to that list, the flow would trigger as well. This specific flow is a reminder flow, so it reminds the owner of the lead that, hey, you need to follow up on the lead. And if you wanted to make it a little bit more complicated, what you could do is you could check after 5 days and see if the user or the owner has responded to the lead, and if they haven't, then send them another nag email saying, you need to do this right now. So that would involve do-untils and conditionals to be used. So pretty simple flows can be built, and you can go and graduate to more complex flows over time. So let's talk a little bit more about the types of triggers that are available within the product. So there are automated triggers, which are event-based. There are also scheduled triggers. So I could say something along the lines of, run this flow at 4 a.m. on a Saturday, because it's going to back up all of my data from, cloud to on-prem or on-prem to cloud, or vice versa. There's also instant flows, like I mentioned, which you can trigger right from your mobile app. So imagine that you want to block off 2 hours on your meeting schedule because you're tired of meetings. So you just click that button, and then off it goes and blocks off 2 hours that can find on your calendar. I personally send work from home notifications to my team, or I also have a OOF flow that basically when I click the button, it asks me for from and to. And as I specify those dates, it'll go set up an out of office message on my inbox, as well as set up the fact that I'll be out of office and all my emails will be kind of auto responded to. So instead of having to go do all that in Outlook, I can just press a button and do that. Actions can range from, again, the variety of 225 plus connectors we have. We also have built-in actions, which includes HTTP, so you can make arbitrary HTTP requests. SharePoint connector specifically also has an HTTP plus SharePoint action. So if you don't find the actions that you need built into the connector, you can use the HTTP plus SharePoint action within the SharePoint connector to make any arbitrary request.
Yeah. The point I would add there, since I've worked with the SharePoint team when they released that, is they use the telemetry from what people are calling with that SharePoint plus HTTP action is to decide what to prioritize to put directly on the connector to make it to use. So you can kind of vote with your flows by building and automating using that action, because they will see what people are attempting to do, what are people trying to do with flows that they can't really do on the connector, and then they will prioritize, those will float to the top of the stack for inclusion on the SharePoint connector itself to get a better experience.
Yep, that's a really cool way to design your product. Immediate feedback from your customers. Yeah, and in addition, there are some inbuilt actions as well that allow you to manipulate and transform data, so you can do things like joins and selects. Imagine you have an array of emails or a collection of emails, and you don't want to send an individual email per person. What you want to do is you want to sort of semicolon delimit and join all these emails into one giant string and then put it in the to line of an email. So these are kind of capabilities that are available in Flow as well. One of the most important parts of Flow is how to sort of flow the data between actions or trigger that appear above subsequent actions. So if I take the example again of when a new item is created in SharePoint, and I want to hook or grab onto the title of that item and the person who created it so that I could send them an email. That's how I use dynamic content in order to make that happen. So in the send email action, and we will see this more in demos, but in the send email action, I'll be using some of these things by grabbing onto them. So in this example, as you see, a binary field, if the input type is binary, then you would see file name, size, and file content, and these kind of variables available from previous actions. Similarly, if the input type was a string field, then you would see string-related outputs that you can grab and use in those input fields and subsequent actions. So when you think about building your workflows, you're not only working with static typed data, but you can also work with dynamic data that comes in, and you can more or less think of these as variables. Bless you. Variables and parameters that can be plugged into the flow so that you don't have to do everything in a more static custom way.
Yeah, it's important to note that what the flow designer shows you initially is based on it attempting to be intelligent about what tokens or what outputs are already available, what is their type, and what is the type of the input that you're currently sitting in. The rest of the tokens are still available. You can expand to see more, to see the rest of them in the case that you want to maybe push it into an expression to do some conversion to make it the right data type. We're also getting into some smarter detection that's not necessarily static based on the types, but is based on the name of the field. So maybe it isn't an email, it typed as an email address, it is a string, but the string contains email or mail or address or something. The designer's getting a little bit smarter about presenting those options and presenting the better options or the more likely options at the top of the output list rather than necessarily sorted alphabetically, which is usually never the way we want to see it. So.
Yep. So Flow also offers team collaboration. Also offers team collaboration. So what this means is I can have more than one authors on a flow, and this specifically allows you to program against some person leaving the team. Let's say, for example, I built a workflow, and then I decide to leave the team or leave the company. The workflow shouldn't stop working. And in this case, having collaborators on the workflow itself helps a lot. You can also take ownership of someone else's workflow if that happens to be the case through the admin center and other tools that we offer. But in general, having multiple owners on a critical flow is always the best practice that we preach. So let's talk a little bit about approvals, right? We talked about the fact that there are built-in approvals available in Flow, and you can use approvals for a lot of scenarios, from HR request forms, document approvals, lead generations, etc. And if you think about where does Flow sit in the SharePoint ecosystem, it is the successor to SharePoint workflows, right? So you will notice that over the next year or so, we will be at almost parity with SharePoint Workflow Designer, and we have substantial functionality today that matches the functionality offered by Workflow Designer, in addition to obviously all the cloud-first, mobile-first features that you get in Flow that are not part of the Workflow Designer.
One other thing to note also is that we recently released custom approvals. So you are not necessarily limited to approve, reject type scenarios, or shoehorning your scenario into something that matches approve, reject. So you can customize, you aren't limited to 2. You could even have 1 approval option if you wanted to serve as a sort of checkpoint or just a review stage before continuing. For someone to acknowledge it, or you could have a yes or a approve with feedback, reject, or decline if reject as a word was not not what you wanted to convey to end users.
Yep, and yeah, that fits in really well with our story to say, hey, approvals are one of the things that we see being used a lot within organizations when they have automations built around them. Because you want to always have some sort of human component to review and finalize and commit the next steps of actions that need to happen. So sequential approvals, parallel approvals, vote kind of like quorum approvals, et cetera, are all available in the product today. You're not limited to simple yes, no kind of approval. Expressions, again, for advanced users, when you want to have transformations within your workflow, you can use these expressions. They can do all sorts of things, generate GUIDs, convert data into binary, and decode from binary into strings, and so on and so forth. Like, a lot of these expressions are available today. You can do math operations, collection operations, string manipulations, etc. And finally, Flow also has a mobile app that allows you to do a bunch of things. You can create new flows on the mobile app, receive push notifications that you customize for yourself. You can invoke instant flows or button flows. You can also grant approvals, so you can approve, reject, these kind of things on the go. You can also monitor activity if you are a maker of a flow. So if you have made like a bunch of flows, you want to see what its health is, are they failing, succeeding, and so on and so forth. All of this can be done from the mobile app as well. So yeah, that was kind of the gist of what kind of features are available at a high level for flow makers. I also want to talk a little bit quickly about admins, right? So if I'm an admin and all these new features would be a little bit scary for me, because now with a workflow automation product that is available for power users, it is quite easy for people to move data around. And if I want to secure my data, I want to ensure that no one takes data outside of the boundaries that I have defined. So in order to do this, we provide a rich capability of tools for admins and sort of environment admins, IT admins, and that sort of personas to monitor what kind of flows are created within their organization, to develop data loss prevention policies that disallow use of one or more connectors together within a single flow. It also offers robust APIs, so you can actually build apps and flows to monitor how apps and flows are used within your organization, right? So I could basically build a flow that says, when someone builds a flow using foo connector, send me a notification so I can block their flow. Or you could have the flow itself automatically go do these things. So these capabilities are specifically built for IT admins and pro developers to ensure that power users don't do incorrect things or malicious things with these tools. Like I said, Admin Center has data loss prevention policies. So this allows you to group connectors into business use versus non-business use. and other categories. So what this would do is, if you categorize a set of connectors as business use only, then only those set of connectors will be able to be used within a single flow. You cannot have connectors that span across multiple categories in the same flow. Yeah, and finally, how does like flow and IT kind of work? How do these two products work together? The way we think about it is we want IT admins to not spend too much time in governing how data moves within their organizations, but thinking about what data to protect versus what data to provide for business users to be productive. And when IT needs to take over certain business processes and automations or apps, there's always a way for them to go do that by growing up to logic apps in the case of Flow. So Flow is built on top of Azure Logic Apps. You can take a Flow, convert it to Azure Logic App, and have an IT admin and a pro dev kind of maintain it and have all the application lifecycle around it. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to David, who's going to show you how he created the flow that we saw in demo number 1. And we are also going to look at some of the admin center features that are available for Flow.
All right, so quick demo just to see what I did here, since this is using some fairly new functionality, so people may not be familiar with it. We're actually going to prepare some templates showing how to do approvals in Teams and get those on the Flow portal so that you can use those as a building block. But I'll show you today. So to go quickly through the topics that Sune went through, triggers. So the trigger in this case, specifically for running flows from the SharePoint modern list, is the for selected item. There's also for selected file for use on document libraries, and the outputs are tailored a little bit for knowing that we're interacting with files versus just a generic list item. And here's where I've added inputs to say I want to prompt the user for optional inputs. It could be made required or allowed to be optional. Then use of the outputs. So what Sune mentioned about the output from that trigger is now used in the get item to get the rest of the item. So what are all of the other properties that may be on it? They might be in views that are not shown to the full set of users, but we still want to fetch the entirety. And as you can see, here is a case of the designer saying, well, there is one output from the for selected item trigger that seems relevant for use in the ID field, so that's what it shows me here. And there is, if I zoom back a little bit, the rest of them. Okay. So Sune also mentioned kind of combining and manipulating data. So something that isn't really a connector per se, or certainly not talking to a remote service to do the manipulation. We call them the built-ins. So I have select and join. So this is a quick example of what Sune mentioned about taking an array of people, so that I have a person column on that SharePoint list, a multi-valued person column specifically, to store the list of one or more approvers. So really what I care about is not all of the fields that come back from SharePoint on that person object, but I care about the email address because that's who I want to send the approval to. So I'm doing a select from, so that is selecting a property off of an array of objects. So this is going to grab the email off of the approvers array. I'm going to then join. This is the output of the select approver emails. So I now have an array of strings of the email addresses. I want to join them all together in a single string with a semicolon because that's what is typically required for anything that accepts multiple email addresses. And now I'm going to create an approval. So for those of you who have used approvals in the past using Flow, we used to have, well, it was called start an approval. We then, for clarity, renamed it start and wait for an approval. So that is a single action that will, when hit in the execution of the flow, will create the approval in the CDS database, send all of the email notifications, and then wait to continue running until the approval criteria is met. Either everybody approved, or somebody approved, or one person rejected, or the thing timed out because we configured it to only run for a certain amount of time. we added a new set of actions labeled V2, specifically called create an approval and wait an approval. So what we wanted to do to open up custom notification scenarios is to detach the provisioning, the approval provisioning step from the waiting on the approval criteria step. So all of the inputs are the same as if we were doing a start and wait for an approval, but this one will create the approval and continue running the flow directly. So the type is still your standard options of everyone must approve, the first to respond, meaning whoever gets to it first, approve or reject, will win what the response is, or custom responses. Wait for everybody or wait for the first response to come in. And then to show what I do with that is I have selected the join approver emails, so the semicolon delimited list of the email addresses. I'm building the approval details using outputs from both the trigger and the get items. So farther down in the flow, I have accessible to me what is above me, what has executed before this particular step in the flow. And then I'm attaching some item link and description to it just to fill out the body of that approval request, whether someone is viewing it in the emails that are received or the Teams notification or on the Flow portal. So now here comes the meat of it. This is what people have wanted for a while, and so what we just shipped is now I can loop over those approver objects that I built together from in this case it was from the column, but it could come from wherever I wanted. It could have come from another list or another data source even, or be hard-coded. We've seen that as well. And then I'm going to post an adaptive card as the flow bot to a user, a long titled action to explain exactly what it's doing. And the recipient is the individual approver I'm looping through in this apply to each, and I'm posting them the adaptive card that was an output of the Teams action, of the approval action. So we spit out an adaptive card that is configured to be able to post back to Flow with all of the details about who is responding with what response, to then go update the approval state machine as to whether the approval should continue. And then finally, I hit that final action, wait for an approval. So this takes one input, and it is the approval ID that is also an output of create an approval to say, okay, I now want to wait for this thing to be complete. In the case when I ran it, it was still stuck in waiting, even though I had replied, until Sune replied, and then it continued on. And so anything post-approval would go after this step. If you wanted to do your own custom notifications, you could also put that within, between the create and wait. You could also log it to SQL, log it to Azure if you wanted to do auditing or tracking of approval processes. Maybe you have something that is in between that has the approval data as to what was the approval ID, who was it responded to, and then you have another log after the wait saying it took this amount of time, and you could do your own dashboarding or metrics off of how long are approval processes within my org or this specific process taking. And you could build dashboards and all of that, right? Yep. You could push that into CDS if you wanted to store additional data. Okay, so now to switch over finally in the last couple minutes, just to show the data policies. So admin.flow.microsoft.com is the existing Flow admin center where you can configure and create environments and then configure data policies. So this is what Sune mentioned about DLP, and I have data groups. And in this particular environment that I'm viewing, many of them are allowed for business data, and there's, oh no, all of them are in this particular one. But I could also subdivide those into sets of connectors that I do not want to be able to mix with business data, and any flows that are detected using that will be automatically disabled.
Yeah. So one common thing that we see admins do is they usually put Twitter, Facebook, and all these social media connectors in the non-business group, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't want someone taking your official business data and like automatically tweeting it out. Mm-hmm. And this is a good way to prevent against that. Yes. Yeah. And
the scope of the policies can either be your entire organization or could be a specific environment. So in that example, maybe there are marketing or the social media team does want to automate. They could put their flows within their own environment that has their own policy. Maybe they are the only people that have access to create or run flows within that organization, or maybe an admin only has permission to create, but they have access to run and trigger. And so that way the permission is scoped so that those flows can exist within the org, but they can't be arbitrarily created to post SharePoint documents to Twitter from within other environments. So as the business apps platform, or the Power Platform, sort of continues to coalesce together to tell an even better story than it already does, we're moving a lot of the admin functionality together into one place. So there's a preview admin center for the Power Platform that is available, where you have even more in-depth detail about apps and flows within your tenant and within your organization. So here we can see kind of already built dashboards showing me within this environment how many runs are there per day, weekly, monthly. You can use that to kind of check against quotas that you may have based on the plans. You can also see, and I like this one specifically for people who are building production workflows. Like, you want to know when those are not working, right? You don't want it to just be silently failing in the background. So we also have error dashboards so that you can see what flows are failing, how are they failing. Same thing applies to Power Apps. The environment that I'm in right now doesn't have any apps, but the Power Apps tab here has who's using your apps, in what countries are people using your apps for multinational corporations, how much is using it, or how many people are using it where, and similar to the flow failures, what are Power Apps failures? So what were exceptions that users hit while using the app, so that you can route those to the developers to fix issues in apps. So we are just about at time.